Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. On behalf of the Asian Studies Center and the Office of China Programs at Michigan State, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation. We are very honored and delighted to have as our speaker today David Firestein. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background about David Firestein before I invite him to the podium to give his talk. David Firestein is the East-West Institute's Vice President for the Strategic Trust Building Initiative and Track 2 Diplomacy. In this capacity, he leads the East-West Institute's China, Russia, and United States program. So you're talking about three of the largest and in many ways geopolitically most important countries in the world. Prior to joining the East-West Institute, David Firestein was a career U.S. diplomat for 18 years. This was from 1992 to 2010. He's an expert in China, Russia, public diplomacy, and U.S. politics. He's actually a fluent speaker of Russian and a near native level Chinese speaker as well, in addition, obviously, to English, which presumably is your mother tongue. He's the author or co-author of multiple books on China. Two of them are China-published bestsellers. He's also written extensively for a variety of newspapers, both in China and outside, and taught a number of courses at a variety of institutions on U.S. China relations. I think I'll stop there on all your experience with China and move straight to the talk. The title of the talk is Toward a New Normal, 9 Tectonic Shifts in U.S. China Relations. And I'd like to welcome David Firestein to give his talk. I should mention that he's been to MSU a number of times in the past, and Chuck Glioso, who was instrumental in making this event possible, actually called him an honorary Spartan. So let's welcome our honorary Spartan, David Firestein, to the podium.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, let me get my microphone here in just the right position. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chandra, for that very gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. It's an honor for me to be back here at Michigan State University. Earlier today, as Professor Chandra mentioned, Dr. Chuck Glioso, who's a dear friend of mine here in the MSU community, introduced me in, among other ways, as an honorary Spartan. And for me, that was music to my ears. I've often rooted for MSU teams over the years. I'm sorry about the loss to OSU recently. That was a tough one. But I'm really honored to be back here and to have an opportunity to be among such distinguished professors and, of course, students and other members of the team. Julie, thank you so much for your help as well. It's always a pleasure to come back to East Lansing. I think the topic today is a very significant one for all of us who are interested not just in the United States or China, and not just in U.S. China relations, but also for all of those who are interested in what's happening globally in international relations and the future of diplomacy, particularly in East Asia, but more broadly as well. And it's the topic of what's happening in U.S. China relations, and more specifically, what I refer to as the 9 tectonic shifts that are occurring beneath the surface, that are very profound, and that are having a very significant impact on U.S. China relations and on the global international politics scene. So today what I want to do is talk for perhaps 35 minutes or so, leaving a good bit of time for your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. And I very much hope that you won't be shy, and I know MSU audiences never are shy, about sharing their insights and asking good questions. But I'd like to talk about 3 categories of changes in the landscape for U.S.-China relations. Number 1, in the economic sphere. Number 2, in the political sphere. And number 3, in the geopolitical sphere. And in each of those 3 categories, I want to highlight what I regard as 3 tectonic shifts in each of those 3 areas for a total of 9 important shifts. Now, let's start with the economic dimension of U.S. China relations. I think at the outset it's important to note that the economic, trade, and investment dimension of U.S. China relations is a profoundly important element of the bilateral relationship. The scale of trade between the 2 countries is virtually unmatched, unrivaled in the world. The 2 countries, the United States and China, do about $500 billion a year in two-way trade. That's a figure that dwarfs virtually every other bilateral trading relationship in the world. Perhaps only the United States and Canada might have a figure that is in excess of that. So you have an enormous relationship that is of deep consequence both to China and to the United States in different ways, and frankly that is enormously consequential for the world economy as well. Obviously the United States is the largest economy in the world. China has become in recent years the second largest economy. And in a few short years, perhaps by 2020, maybe even a year or 2 earlier, China is projected to overtake the United States as the #1 largest economy in the world. So what's happening economically in terms of the U.S.-China relationship is very significant for both these 2 countries and more broadly. And within the context of economics, there are 3 very significant, as I would call it, tectonic shifts that are playing out, and that's what I'd like to talk about now. The first such shift is that it has 2 parts to it, and that is that for the first time in modern history, the United States is dealing with China out of a position of sustained economic weakness. Now, there have been patches here and there where the United States has been weaker than it is in its strongest years economically, but now in the last 4, 5, 6 years, we've really been dealing with China from a position of sustained economic weakness, and that, I would argue, is unprecedented in the modern era. At the same time, and this is Tectonic Shift 1, Part B, China is now dealing with the United States from a position of slowing economic growth. Still rapid growth, but slowing growth relative to the extraordinary rates of economic growth that we've seen in China over the last 30-plus years. For about 30 years, from 1979 or 1980 until about 2010 or 2011, the Chinese economy grew at about 10% a year on an annualized basis. That is probably a figure, an amount of economic growth over a protracted period of time that is unprecedented in the history of human economic endeavor. And now, China is growing in a different way, qualitatively, and at a different level. Growth now is about 7.8%, 8.2%. It's still enormously strong by any normal standard, but it's not what it was. So if you think of it in relative to recent past economic performance, China's growth is 20% less strong, if you will, than it was when it was 10%. So take those 2 phenomena and put them together, and you've got the United States dealing with China from a position of sustained economic weakness for the first time in the modern era, sustained economic weakness, and China dealing with the United States from a position of slowing growth relative to past performance. Together, that is tectonic shift #1, and the first one under the economic rubric, that I would argue is likely to complicate, along with the other factors that I'll mention, U.S.-China relations as we move forward into the next decade. By the same token, another very significant phenomenon is occurring, also in the economic category, and that is that China is moving up the value chain as a producer of goods and services, economically speaking. So whereas not too many years ago, the United States principally imported from China such things as clothes, shoes, plastics, toys, kitchen utensils, and kind of lower level goods and services, principally goods. Today, the United States is, in some cases, importing from China solar panels, wind turbine technologies, computers and other high-tech equipment, telecommunications equipment that in many cases is at world levels of quality, and the list goes on. So the kinds of things that we're now importing from China are very different qualitatively than what we were importing some years ago. And as a result of that, the level of competition and perceived competition between the United States and China on economic and trade matters has intensified from a U.S. perspective, because quite frankly, now we're competing with China on areas that the U.S. president and many other officials have cited as key engines of potential U.S. economic growth going forward. So the competition now is hitting closer and closer to home and closer to the heart of the U.S. economy, our 21st century knowledge economy, and at the heart of those sectors that are going to drive U.S. growth as we go forward. That's a tectonic shift, China moving up the value chain, that's going to have a significant impact on U.S.-China relations. The third point that I would mention as an economic change is also very significant. And I think you can see when you add this to the other points, it starts to create, along with the political and geopolitical factors, a potentially very volatile mix of considerations as we look at U.S.-China relations going forward. And that third economic shift is the deterioration, I would say the steady and maybe even dramatic deterioration of U.S. business sector support for U.S.-China relations. For many years, in fact for decades, back to normalization in 1979, the U.S. business community writ large has been a huge advocate for the improvement of U.S.-China relations, even when it wasn't particularly popular politically in the United States. So, for example, if we think back to the period immediately after Tiananmen in 1989, 1990, 1991, and even the 92 presidential campaign, it was not a popular point of view to say, let's engage China, let's deal with the Chinese leadership, let's open markets, let's expand our trade and investment. There were many voices in this country that said, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense to us against the backdrop of what has happened in China. But the business community was always an advocate for improved and strengthened U.S.-China business and trade relations. In recent years, that has started to change. And it's changing for a number of reasons. I think chief among them is a protracted problem that has not yet been satisfactorily resolved from a U.S. perspective around the issue of intellectual property rights protection. The fact is the United States and U.S. producers, businesses, farmers, providers of goods and services lose tens of billions of dollars in lost revenues to theft of intellectual property in China that occurs every year. It's a well-documented fact. It's not really even debated, frankly, between elites and leaders on both sides. The question is what can be done about it and how quickly can it be done. But the prolonged difficulties and inability to get satisfactory resolution to the issue of intellectual property rights in China, that is the protection of U.S. IPR in China, is starting to sour the business community on China and on prospects for doing business there in a way that was not true even 3 or 4 years ago. There are other issues as well. Market access is still problematic in many ways. Many U.S. business figures had said, let's just give this time. You know, if we cast a long line, we can catch a big fish, as the saying goes in Chinese. So let's give it time, let's be patient. But in fact, that patience has not seemed to bear any real results for many U.S. Business leaders. And as a result, there's a souring of sentiment with respect to China. And then there are issues like indigenous innovation, the Chinese currency, the renminbi, and other concerns that collectively have caused U.S. business leaders to rethink whether China is really as attractive a market as it was in their mind, at least, in their vision some years ago. So those are 3 very significant changes that are now taking place. And I think if you add those together, the weakness in relative terms in the economies, the moving up of the value chain, and this last point I mentioned about U.S. communities, business communities' views on China as a business environment and the deterioration in those sentiments, you can see that we're moving into some uncharted territory because none of these things have been true in recent years, but they're true today. So on the economic side, I would offer those as three tectonic shifts. You don't necessarily hear about them every day in the papers. You don't necessarily see them at the surface level, although increasingly I think we do. But underneath the surface, these things are playing out. The second point that I would make pertains to politics. I think similarly there are three things that are happening in politics that are creating a more complex and complicated environment within which to engage in relations between the two countries. So let me say a few words about that. I think it's worth starting with what I would call the first point. And it's, in a sense, it's a tectonic moment in the relationship that the residue of which continues to be with us as we go forward. It's not a change per se, but it's kind of a change in the context in which U.S. China relations play out. And that is the following. Last year, the year 2012, was the first year in 20 years in which the U.S. presidential election and the Chinese political or party transition occurred in the same year. That happens only every 20 years. That's so because the Chinese system is on a 5-year cycle and the U.S. political system is on a 4-year cycle. And so it's only every 20 years that those two cycles converge into the same year, and last year was one of those years. Moreover, in 1992, which was the last year in which that convergence occurred, there was no change at the top of the Chinese national leadership, at the very top. Jiang Zemin was the leader of China before 1992, and he was clearly going to remain the leader of China after the Party Congress of 1992. And so, unlike this year, in that particular year, there wasn't a change in China, whereas there was in the United States. So if you think of it that way, and you'll see the point that I'm coming to here in a moment, the 2012, the year 2012, was the first year in history in which there were real or possible changes in the leaderships of the two nations playing out at the same time. Now, what does that mean in a pragmatic sense? Well, what happens usually in all the off years where either we have an election and the Chinese don't have a transition, or they have a party transition and we don't have an election, what normally happens is when one side is going through the tough and heated rhetoric of the politics of U.S. China relations, the other side is not, which means that the two leaderships are not going through those tough rhetorical and political demands at the same time, which means that the side that's not facing an election or a transition can be a little bit more restrained and a little bit more tolerant of rhetorical excesses on the other side, because after all, this is not their year for a transition. In 2012, that changed. So both on the U.S. side in our presidential election and on the Chinese side in the Chinese Communist Party's party transition in November of last year, both sides in their own ways, in very different ways, were going through some sharp-elbowed politics at the same time. And so, in a sense, it created a mutually kind of inflammatory environment rhetorically in various ways, and I could cite examples, that contributed to a more negative atmospherics in U.S.-China relations than we've seen politically in some time. The residue of that unique and first ever convergence in 2012 is with us today. And so we see, and I can cite examples shortly, but we can see examples of tough language enduring on from this intense political season in a way that might not have occurred had the two electoral seasons or transition seasons occurred at different times as they normally do. So that is the first tectonic point that I would make. The second shift that I would talk about is actually three different things, and it's what I would call the three shifts in how U.S. political leaders think about and frame and talk about China as a topic in our political discourse. Three shifts within this one tectonic shift. And the three shifts are as follows. First of all, whereas in the past U.S. political figures from both parties thought of China principally through the prism of human rights, today that has changed, and now political leaders think about China and talk about China principally through the prism of trade, economics, and investment, and ultimately national competition. National competition. So we went from a human rights frame to a national competition frame in a short period of time. I'll cite an example of that in a minute. The second basic change is that, and it's concomitant, if you will, to the first, that China went from being, and here I'll just say, this sounds kind of odd, and it is, and I'll give you examples in a second. China went from being a foreign policy issue in the United States to what it is now, a domestic policy issue in the United States. China is no longer a foreign policy issue in this country. It's a domestic policy issue. And I'll cite examples of that, but it's a remarkable change in the way U.S. political leaders, including aspiring candidates for president from both parties and others, view China. And the third change that I would note is that whereas China used to be a measuring stick in the context of U.S. politics for personal toughness, or I would even say machismo, on the campaign trail, now it has become a measuring stick for America's national adequacy or national worth, or as the case may be, our national inadequacy. So rather than holding up China to show you, let's say, the voters of East Lansing, how tough I, a candidate, am about China, I now hold China up to show how much work we in America have to do to catch up in certain important areas. That is a huge change in the way we talk about China. This is worth mentioning, I think. This is all the second political tectonic shift. But I think it bears drilling down with a couple of more sentences each to give you examples of what I'm talking about, because this is a very remarkable change that has occurred. With respect to the first point, human rights becoming now national competition, I would point to President Obama's last three State of the Union addresses. In the last three State of the Union addresses, 2011, 2012, and 2013, President Obama mentioned China exactly 8 times. 3 in 2011, 4 in 2012, and 1 in 2013. All 8 of those references were to China as an economic competitor of America. None of those references were to China as a human rights issue. That's just one example. I could cite others. But I think it's emblematic of this change of framing. China as economic competitor, better test scores, better production of clean energy, science and technology, better public policy planning, etc., etc. These are the arguments that are put forward, including by our president. And that's a different way of talking about China. The second point, I mentioned that China has gone from being a foreign policy issue to being a domestic policy issue. I'll give you 2 data points. In those same State of the Union addresses, there is a domestic section and a foreign policy section to presidential State of the Union addresses. China, in the last 3 years, has never, not even once, been mentioned in the foreign policy sections of those addresses. It has exclusively been mentioned in the domestic policy sections of those addresses. Now, just think about that for a second. This is the world's biggest economy, a P5, permanent member of the Security Council member with veto power over UN action, huge economy, huge trader, major player, nuclear power, issues of Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, cybersecurity, and the list goes on, and yet it's never mentioned as a foreign policy issue. Similarly, when the Republicans were debating amongst themselves and vying for the Republican nomination for president a year ago, there were 24, 25 or so debates started with 9 or 8 people, and then it whittled down to the last 3 or 4. There were about 6 of those debates that were devoted to foreign policy. China was never mentioned in any of them. Remarkable. Most important